December 19, 1944. A gray winter light leaked through the shattered windows of a converted French army barracks in Verdun. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke, the bitter smell of coffee, and something heavier. Around a long wooden table sat the most powerful generals in the Allied command. Map folders lay open. Pencils were clenched in tired fingers. Ashtrays overflowed. Not a single man in that room was smiling. 3 days earlier, over 200,000 German soldiers had slammed into American lines in the Ardennes forest. The blow had come out of nowhere. Allied intelligence had assured everyone that Germany was exhausted, incapable of major offensive action. Yet now, American units were being overrun, surrounded, and in some cases simply erased from the map. At the head of the table sat Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander. He studied the map spread before him, red and blue arrows stabbing into the Ardennes like wounds. The room buzzed with low murmurs until Eisenhower raised his head. His voice, when he spoke, cut through the tension. He asked one question. The question every man there had been silently dreading. How soon could someone attack north to relieve Bastogne? Silence fell like a curtain. Generals stared down at their maps and notes, minds racing through impossible calculations. Distances, fuel, ammunition, road capacity, winter storms. To disengage entire formations, turn them around in freezing weather, and hurl them into a new battle on short notice. It was the kind of logistical nightmare war colleges used as hypothetical exercises. No one wanted to be the first to answer. Then Patton spoke. I can attack with 2 divisions in 48 hours. Heads snapped toward him. Some officers blinked in disbelief. A few thought he must be joking, trying to impress Eisenhower with yet another bold claim. 48 hours to disengage multiple divisions from active combat. Will an entire army 90 degrees move more than 100,000 men and thousands of vehicles over frozen narrow roads, then attack into prepared German positions? It was beyond optimistic. It sounded operationally insane. But Patton's face was calm. His tone matter-of-fact. There was no boast in his voice. What the other generals didn't see was the slight tremor in Patton's right hand as he reached for his lighter. The way his jaw clenched when Eisenhower's eyes locked onto his. The cold sweat gathering beneath his wool uniform despite the December chill. Patton, the most aggressive general in the American army, the man who seemed to live for combat, was terrified. Not of the Germans. Not of the battle itself. He was terrified because he had just promised the impossible. And if he failed, thousands of men would die, the Allied front could collapse, and his name would be remembered not as a hero, but as the general who gambled away an entire army. Patton left the conference room and stepped outside into the frozen courtyard. Snow crunched beneath his boots. His breath hung in the air like smoke. For a moment, he was alone. He pulled out a cigarette. His hands were steady now. They always steadied once the performance was over. But the fear remained, coiled tight in his chest like a spring wound too far. He had just bet everything. Not just his career. Not just his reputation. He had bet 133,000 men, thousands of vehicles, the entire operational capability of Third Army. If his rapid pivot failed, if his divisions got stuck on frozen roads, if German forces cut them off, if supplies couldn't reach them in time, Third Army could be annihilated. Eisenhower had accepted his promise. There was no going back. Patton knew the numbers. His staff had worked them out during the secret planning. Even under perfect conditions, with clear roads, no enemy interference, and flawless execution, it was a 55-45 gamble. And conditions were not perfect. A snowstorm was forecast. German reconnaissance planes were circling. The roads into the Ardennes were narrow, winding, and already choked with retreating American units, supply trucks, and refugees fleeing the advancing Wehrmacht. One broken bridge. One fuel convoy ambushed. One critical junction blocked. Any single failure could unravel the entire operation. Patton finished his cigarette and flicked it into the snow. He watched the ember die in the white. Then he turned and walked back inside. He had a phone call to make. To understand why Patton was terrified, you have to go back 10 days. December 9, 1944. The headquarters of the U.S. Third Army in Nancy, France. Patton's forces were pushing toward Germany, planning further advances into the Saar region. On the surface, everything pointed toward eventual Allied victory. The German army seemed to be collapsing bit by bit. Most senior commanders believed the war in Europe might be over soon. Colonel Oskar Koch, Patton's G2, the officer responsible for intelligence, saw something different. That day, Koch walked into Patton's office carrying an armful of reports, maps, and decoded signals. Koch was not a man of theatrics. He was meticulous, analytical, and cautious. But there was urgency in his eyes as he spread his documents across Patton's desk. For weeks, he had been monitoring German troop movements all along the Western Front. And a disturbing pattern had emerged. 15 German divisions had vanished. These weren't skeleton units or battered remnants. They were full-strength divisions, including several panzer formations with hundreds of tanks. They had been withdrawn from the line, but no one at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force seemed to know exactly where they had gone. Koch traced lines on the map with his pencil, showing Patton where he believed the missing divisions were concentrating. He pointed to the Ardennes. Patton listened. His face remained impassive, but inside, his mind was racing. He understood what Koch was saying. And he understood what it meant if Koch was right. It meant that within the next 2 weeks, the Germans would launch a major offensive. It meant that American units in the Ardennes, thinly spread and unprepared, would be slaughtered. It meant that the war everyone thought was nearly over could explode into chaos. And it meant that George S. Patton had to make an impossible decision. If he prepared for an attack and was wrong, he would waste precious resources, disrupt his own offensive, and look like a paranoid fool. His superiors already thought he was too aggressive, too impulsive. This would confirm their doubts. But if he didn't prepare and Koch was right, American soldiers would die. Units would be overrun. The Allied front could shatter. Worse, Koch couldn't say exactly when or where the attack would come. Just sometime in the next 2 weeks. Somewhere in the Ardennes sector. Patton would have to plan for a ghost. He picked up the phone and called General Omar Bradley, his immediate superior. He presented Koch's assessment clearly. Missing panzer divisions. Suspicious movements. The weak American line in the Ardennes. Bradley heard him out but remained unconvinced. SHF intelligence disagreed. They believed Germany simply didn't have the strength left for a major offensive. The war, they insisted, was in its final phase. Bradley advised Patton not to worry. Patton put the receiver down slowly and looked back at Koch. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he gave a simple order. Start planning. But even as the words left his mouth, doubt gnawed at him. What if Koch was wrong? What if Patton was about to sabotage his own army based on a hunch? From that moment on, while Third Army continued to attack in the Saar, a secret effort began behind the scenes. Patton's staff, under Koch's guidance, drew up 3 detailed contingency plans for a rapid pivot north in response to a German offensive in the Ardennes. The work was painstaking. Truck routes were charted down to specific roads and intersections. Fuel supplies were pre-positioned where they could be quickly shifted. Artillery units were earmarked for fast redeployment. Infantry regiments were assigned exact assembly areas, staging points, and march tables. Every plan depended on precision and coordination on an almost unimaginable scale. But the work was done in secret, quietly, without fanfare. And Patton's officers were not happy. Some thought their commander had finally gone too far. Why divert time and energy to hypothetical emergencies 100 miles away while they were actively fighting in another sector? Why plan to pull back from an advance they were winning? Whispers spread through headquarters. Patton's losing it. He's obsessed with something that isn't going to happen. He's wasting our time. Patton heard the whispers. He couldn't explain. Not fully. If he told his staff that he was preparing for a massive German offensive that SHF said wasn't coming, he would undermine their confidence. Worse, if word got out, Bradley might order him to stop. So Patton suffered their silent judgment. And every night, alone in his quarters, the doubt grew. He spread maps across his desk. Red pencil lines crisscrossing French roads. Blue circles marking assembly areas. Black arrows showing German attack vectors. What if Koch is wrong? What if I pull my divisions back for nothing? What if the Germans attack from a different direction? What if the roads ice over and my tanks can't move? What if fuel doesn't arrive in time? The questions multiplied. Each plan had 50 variables. Each variable had 10 failure points. Patton smoked through packs of cigarettes. Slept 3, maybe 4 hours a night. Snapped at aides over minor details. His staff noticed. General Hobart Gay, his chief of staff, asked if he was feeling well. Patton waved him off. But the truth was, Georges, Patton was carrying a weight no one else could see. He had bet his judgment against the entire Allied intelligence apparatus. He had committed resources to a plan that might never be needed. And if he was wrong, his career was over. If he was right, thousands of men might die anyway. There was no good outcome. Only degrees of catastrophe. 5:30 a.m., December 16, 1944. The stillness of the winter morning shattered as German artillery opened up along an 80-mile front. Thousands of shells rained down on American positions. Communications lines were severed. Forward posts obliterated. Entire sectors plunged into confusion. Then the infantry came. Then the tanks. 3 German armies. More than 200,000 men. Slamming into 4 overstretched American divisions. At 3rd Army headquarters, an aide burst into Patton's office with the first reports. Patton read them. His face betrayed nothing. Then he turned to Koch. "You were right," he said quietly. But there was no triumph in his voice. No satisfaction. Because now the theoretical had become real. Men were dying. Units were being overrun. The 106th Infantry Division, new to the front, was being shattered. And somewhere out there, the 101st Airborne was about to be surrounded in a small Belgian town called Bastogne. Patton knew what was coming next. Within hours, Eisenhower would call a conference. The question would be asked. And Patton would have to deliver on a promise no sane commander should make. For the next 3 hours, Patton paced his office. Chain smoking. Reviewing maps. Calculating distances. Rechecking numbers he'd already checked a dozen times. His aides stayed out of his way. They'd never seen him like this. Not anxious, exactly, but coiled. Like a spring wound too tight. Patton kept recalculating. As if checking the numbers one more time could change reality. 133,000 men. 70 miles of icy roads. 48 hours. What if the roads are impassable? What if fuel doesn't arrive? What if I've just sent my men into a death trap? At 11 a.m., the call came. Eisenhower was convening an emergency conference in Verdun. All senior commanders. Immediately, Patton hung up the phone. He stood alone in his office for a long moment. Then he reached for his coat. It was time to perform. Patton walked into that conference room carrying 11 days of invisible preparation and 3 sleepless nights of dread. He saw the doubt on the other generals' faces. The exhaustion. The barely concealed panic. He heard Eisenhower's desperation when the question was asked. How soon? And Patton knew that if he showed even a flicker of uncertainty, Ike would choose someone else. Or worse, delay. And every hour of delay meant more men dying in Bastogne. So Patton delivered the performance of his career. Confident. Matter of fact. I can attack with 2 divisions in 48 hours. Inside, he was screaming. Because he knew the truth. He was about to attempt the most ambitious military maneuver in modern warfare. A 90-degree pivot of an entire army, in winter, under fire, across impossible terrain. And there was a very real chance it wouldn't work. Eisenhower stared at him. "George, this is no time for grandstanding." Patton didn't blink. "Ike, I've already given the orders. 3rd Army is disengaging now. I have 3 contingency plans ready. I've been expecting this attack for 11 days. The room absorbed that in stunned silence. Eisenhower watched him carefully. He'd known Patton for years. He knew when the man was bluffing. This time, Patton wasn't bluffing. But what Eisenhower didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that Patton wasn't certain either. He was betting. Gambling. Hoping. Eisenhower nodded slowly. "All right, George. Get moving. Patton left the conference, found a telephone, and placed one call to his chief of staff. He spoke 2 words. Play ball. And then it was done. Patton hung up the phone. His hand was shaking. He lit another cigarette. The match trembled slightly before catching. Those 2 words, play ball, had just triggered the carefully constructed machinery of Koch's plans. Orders were flashing through radio nets and telephone lines. Truck convoys, already organized and positioned, were beginning to load men and equipment. Tanks and armored vehicles were rolling out of their current positions, turning north. There was no going back now. If Third Army got stranded in a snowstorm, if German forces ambushed the columns, if the 101st Airborne was overrun before he arrived, history would remember George S. Patton as the general who threw away an entire army on a reckless gamble. He sat down in a chair near the telephone. Alone. For a few minutes, he didn't move. Didn't speak. Just smoked. He had done everything he could. Planned every detail. Positioned every unit. Calculated every route. Now it was out of his hands. All he could do was wait. And hope. The movement began. And immediately, things started going wrong. Not catastrophically. But close. Hour 6, snow began falling heavier than forecasted. Visibility dropped. Roads became slick. Tanks slowed to a crawl. Hour 12, a fuel convoy took a wrong turn in the dark. It took 3 hours to find them and redirect them. 3 hours. Tanks idling in the cold, burning precious fuel, waiting. Hour 18, 2 divisions nearly collided at a critical crossroads. Traffic snarled for 40 minutes while military police screamed orders and waved flashlights. Patton received the report and felt his stomach drop. Hour 24. A bridge across a river near Ardennes began groaning under the weight of Sherman tanks. Engineers inspected it, declared it barely safe. The column continued, slower now, every vehicle a potential disaster. Hour 36. German reconnaissance planes spotted the movement. Radio intercepts confirmed it. The enemy knew Third Army was coming. Patton learned this and understood. Surprise was gone. Now it was a race. Hour 48. Lead elements of the 4th Armored Division reached their jumping-off points. Barely. They had covered over 100 miles in 48 hours, disengaging from combat and redeploying in some of the worst winter weather Europe had seen in decades. They were exhausted. Low on fuel. Some units were still straggling in. But they were there. Patton stood in his command post, staring at the map. Red arrows marking Third Army's advance. Blue circles around Bastogne. He had done it. Barely. For 72 hours, he had received reports of near disasters narrowly avoided. Each one a reminder that he was one blown bridge, one ambush, one logistical failure away from catastrophe. His staff later admitted they thought the operation might collapse at several points. But Patton never let them see his fear. He barked orders. Micromanaged details. Demanded updates every hour. Not because he was confident. Because he was terrified. December 26, 1944. 4:50 p.m. The radio crackled in Patton's command post. We're through to Bastogne. Lieutenant Charles Bogus, commanding the Sherman tank Cobra King of 4th Armored Division, had broken through the last German positions near the village of Ardennes. Physical contact with elements of the 101st Airborne. The siege of Bastogne was broken. Patton picked up the telephone. Called Eisenhower. We're through to Bastogne, he reported. His voice was steady. Professional. Eisenhower congratulated him. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. Patton hung up. And then, alone in his command post, he broke. Not publicly. Not dramatically. He simply sat down in his chair and stared at the wall. For 20 minutes, he didn't move. Didn't speak. His aides stayed away, sensing something they didn't fully understand. Some accounts suggest he wept briefly, though he would never admit it. Others say he simply sat in silence, his hands trembling slightly, the cigarette burning forgotten between his fingers. The terror he had suppressed for 17 days crashed over him all at once. He had gambled everything. And won. But it had been so much closer than anyone knew. One blown bridge. One ambushed convoy. One wrong turn in the dark, any single failure, and Bastogne would have fallen. Third Army would have been stranded. Thousands of men would have died. Patton had carried that weight alone. The fear, the doubt, the suffocating pressure of knowing that his decisions could kill thousands. And no one had seen it, because that was what command required. The mask, the performance, the illusion of certainty. His aides noticed something different about him after Bastogne. Quieter, more introspective, less likely to brag. One officer later said, "The old man was never quite the same after the Bulge. Something had changed." What changed was this. Patton had looked into the abyss of his own failure and seen how close he'd come to falling in. After the war, Patton became a legend. The bold, brash general who relieved Bastogne in 48 hours. The man who turned an entire army 90 degrees in the middle of winter and struck like thunder. But the hidden story, his terror, his doubts, his near collapse, was buried. Because military history celebrates decisive action, not internal struggle. We remember the confident promise at Verdun. We forget the shaking hands afterward. But here's the truth that no one talks about. Patton's fear was the key to his success. He was terrified because he understood the stakes. He prepared obsessively because he knew how easily it could fail. His panic wasn't a weakness. It was his edge. The generals who dismissed Koch's warning? They weren't confident. They were complacent. They believed the war was almost over because they wanted to believe it. Because it was comfortable. Because accepting the possibility of a massive German offensive meant accepting that they might have been wrong. Patton's terror kept him sharp. It forced him to plan for the worst. To check and recheck. To position fuel and ammunition where others saw no need. To draw up contingency plans while everyone else focused on advancing. True confidence isn't the absence of fear. True confidence is the decision to act despite it. Patton was terrified. But he acted anyway. He channeled his fear into preparation. He used his doubt as fuel for obsessive planning. He performed calm certainty in public while carrying private dread. And that's what made him great. History is full of leaders who succeeded not in spite of their fear, but because of it. Fear sharpens judgment. It forces you to see risks others ignore. It drives preparation that seems excessive until the moment it saves your life. The leaders who seem most fearless are often the ones carrying the most fear. They've just learned to use it. After the war, someone asked Patton what he thought about during those 17 days between Koch's warning and the relief of Bastogne. He paused, lit the cigarette, looked out the window. Then he said, "I thought about all the ways it could go wrong. And I planned for every single one of them." That's leadership, not the absence of fear. The decision to carry it, alone, and move forward anyway. Patton stood in a conference room in Verdun and promised the impossible. His hand trembled when he lit his cigar. His jaw clenched under Eisenhower's gaze. Cold sweat gathered beneath his uniform. But no one noticed. Because that was the performance. That was the mask. And beneath it, Patton was terrified. But he did it anyway.